In the mid-'80s, fewer than 3% of all people in most of our countries were using cell phones. But you fast forward to today, when almost 100% of people are using cell phones.
By the time they're 19 or 20 years old, they will have used the phone for 10 years, and we have no idea what type of risk that's carrying.
We've immersed ourselves in an ocean of electromagnetic radiation. It's all around us now. Invisible, we can't see it, but we know it's there. Every time you lift up your mobile phone, you know it's there.
It's very, very hard to turn the clock back, or if not impossible to turn the clock back. But we need to be aware of the adverse health effects so that we have the choice of taking precaution against the exposures.
At present, the World Health Organization statements regarding this are that it is real.
We were not the only cancer cluster around a foam mast. There are many cancer clusters around foam masts.
Most of the cancers which will arrive haven't arrived yet. How could we have possibly thought putting microwaves to our brain was safe?
We just don't fully understand yet what we're doing.
We have an announcement finally on whether cell phones cause cancer.
Colony collapse disorder has affected hives all around the world, with some countries reporting losses of up to 70%. A variety of reasons have been offered as to its cause, but none of them have been able to conclusively explain why all of a sudden bees don't return to their hives. Apart from one, a sensational piece of research by Joseph Kuhn and his team. In an experiment, the doctor worked with 8 beehives and placed a regular home deck phone inside half of them. The scientists then monitored if the presence of a deck phone would affect the way that bees returned to their hive. The results were astonishing. In the hives where no deck phone was present, the bees returned at a normal rate. But in the hives which contained a deck phone, the bees hardly returned at all. In one hive containing a deck phone, not a single bee returned. To fully understand the relevance of Dr. Kuhn's experiment, we must first understand how a deck phone works. The reason you are able to walk around your home talking on your deck phone is because the base station of the deck phone sends electromagnetic frequency waves called microwaves to the handset. This is exactly the same way that a mobile phone mast communicates with a mobile phone. A deck phone is basically a miniature version of a mobile phone mast. If a bee is affected by what comes out of a deck phone, it will most definitely be affected by what comes out of a mobile phone mast. And with 4 billion mobile phone users around the world, all of a sudden, there are an awful lot of mobile phone masts. The bee's magnetic sense allows it to navigate using the magnetic lines of the Earth. an ability it has spent millions of years fine-tuning and developing. Does it stand to reason then that such an acute sensitivity would be affected by even the slightest change in the electromagnetic environment? So what about a gargantuan change, and one which has happened almost overnight? Are there other species that have this sensitivity to magnetic fields? A sensitivity which ultimately makes them vulnerable to man-made frequencies. Unfortunately, the discovery of a new protein cell called a cryptochrome suggests all life has a magnetic sense.
There's certainly solid scientific reason for supposing that magnetic fields, artificial magnetic fields, will disturb the habitat of a number of species.
How much has our environment changed because of electromagnetic fields?
Over the last 25 years, it's changed beyond recognition. Just beyond recognition. It's millions and millions of times in terms of electromagnetic energy.
The former National Radiological Protection Board, in one of their documents, said that they thought that the radiation environment, if you like to call it that, had increased many millions of times from what it was 50 years ago. Many millions of times.
It's an enormous change in environment on Earth, and it completely swamps all these natural signals, including the Schumann waves that we have evolved with.
One of the reasons that cryptochromes are particularly interesting from the point of view of human beings detecting magnetic fields is that there's a recently study by Dr. Foley and colleagues showing that if you put human cryptochromes into the fruit fly, then the fruit fly is magnetically sensitive because of the presence of these human cryptochromes. So this is actually showing that human cryptochromes are magnetically sensitive, actually detect magnetic fields.
The discovery of the cryptochrome cell has sparked new interest in the magnetic sense of man, a sense that Robin Baker had predicted some 40 years ago.
This is not some kind of scientific blind man's buff. It's an experiment to find out whether children have a sense of direction. Blindfolded and ear-muffed, the subject is turned around in a special chair until he can't remember which direction he's facing. The chair stops and the subject guesses whether he's facing east, west, north or south. West. The guess is recorded in a small computer. If children had no sense of direction, their guesses would be random, but they're not. Children after the age of about 10 or 11 make pretty good guesses. It seems they have a real sense of direction. And it seems to be a magnetic sense. When the scientists strap a magnet to the subject's head, it disrupts his sense of direction severely.
And this is a huge advance in understanding. It begs all sorts of questions. It begs questions as to whether human beings can actually navigate in the Earth's magnetic field. Even though they don't do it today, did they do it thousands of years ago, and of course it begs the question as to whether this is a process by which magnetic fields are actually detected in the human body, which leads to this disturbance of circadian rhythms, which would explain all these adverse health effects that we see so much of in the epidemiological studies of the health of magnetic fields.
If mankind has the ability to sense magnetic fields, the same ability as the bees, the birds, and the butterflies, does that also mean that we are as vulnerable as they are to man-made frequencies? Will changes in our environment affect us, as it's clearly affecting them? Rolling. Okay, so what is how to describe electrosensitivity?
Electrical sensitivity is when people start reacting, their body starts reacting to electromagnetic fields. Generally speaking, the electromagnetic fields that they'll be reacting to is wireless. So it'll be wireless communications, it'll be Wi-Fi, it'll be cordless phones, deck phones, mobile phones, masts. All of them emitting signals that our body has never experienced before. And when people start to become affected, when I became affected, the way that it starts to affect you is, generally speaking, it's your head first, and it will start giving you pains in your head. But I hate to use the word headache, because it's pains in your head that is unlike any other headache you've ever had before.
Most people's complaints are things like cardiac arrhythmia, insomnia, headache, visual disturbance, vertigo, different kinds of paresthesias or neurasthesias where they are feeling unusual sensations within their body. But really it can also affect endocrine function, thyroid function. Again, the list is really endless.
In my particular case, and this is not everybody's case, if I then don't get out of the environment, I start getting quite severe pains in my gut, and that will then mean it's too late, and I will then start bleeding internally.
So
it's pretty ugly, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's constant as well. One thing you'll notice is it doesn't stop. It's 24/7. This is what's coming out of the mast. If you can see the mast, you're being exposed to it.
Right.
Frankly, even if you can't, you're being exposed to it if you're this distance away, because it'll pass through, concrete walls and things. It'll dampen it a bit, but not very much. If you're within 200-300 metres of the mast up there, this is what you're going to be exposed to 24/7.
When you can hear it, it changes everything.
It does.
Imagine if you could see it.
It'd be the equivalent of seeing a daily smog.
Yeah. With a constant smog of man-made frequencies surrounding our daily lives, and no testing as to its safety, is there any wonder people's bodies have started to react?
Well, it was almost 10 years ago, and I was in my 30s. No history of breast cancer in my family, and living a really healthy lifestyle. I'd been living next to a foam mast for many years, over 7 years by then.
How far was that from?
It was 100 metres from the house.
Right, so pretty close.
Yeah, and for years I'd been having symptoms which hadn't related to the foam mast, because I didn't know anything about the condition of electrosensitivity then. And I'd been having vertigo, sleep problems, headaches, sharp pains in my head. And I'd often visit the doctor only to be told it was either stress or a virus. And then, just out of the blue, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. And it was the biggest shock of my life. And at first I thought, well, it's bad luck, it's just unlucky, it's me. And started to go through my treatment. And it was then I started bumping into neighbours in the hospital. And I only lived in a small village.
Right.
And started bumping into other young ladies as well who were neighbours.
Young? How old?
Oh, well, I was the youngest in my 30s, but the others were in their 40s or early 50s.
Right, that's very young.
And that was 5 of us all diagnosed at once, within 6 months of each other, with breast cancer.
There were only 18 houses in the village surrounding the foam mast, so Eileen decided to conduct a survey to see if anybody else had suddenly started suffering ill health.
What came back really frightened us. Lots of people were reporting the same symptoms that I've been suffering with for years.
Vertigo.
Yeah, the headaches, the vertigo. But there was other young women in the village who were having fertility problems and precancer cervical cells. Other young ladies who'd had breast cancer benign lumps, and there were other conditions of cancer as well in the area. One of our neighbours, who was only 51, had developed motor neurone disease, and he unfortunately died. And so we unearthed a horrendous can of worms. We've done a count of 77 people in the houses.
And out of 77 people, how many people were suffering biological effects?
The estimate was around 70%. People
70% of people
who'd had effects over the years with biological effects, sleep problems, skin rashes, benign lumps or cancer. It was it had a big impact on people in the village. I think this is a global, massive problem. We found since then that we were not the only cancer cluster around a foam mast. There are many cancer clusters around foam masts. And we'd worked with a local scientist where we looked at other foam masts that have been in areas for a long time and conducted other surveys and found other cancer clusters as well.
With so many phones and masts, and a mobile phone industry worth trillions, you would hope that by now a strict governing body would have been installed, an iron-fisted regulator who ensures the telecoms industry errs on the side of caution. Someone to set strict levels which protect the public. Someone to ensure that what we're being exposed to is absolutely safe. Unfortunately, we don't have any of that. What we do have is ICNIRP.
Well, ICNIRP was set up in Europe about 20 odd years ago to look into non-ionising radiation. It stands for the International Committee of Non-Ionising Radiation Protection, and their job is to look at all the literature that comes out and basically summarise it, say this is what the science definitely says.
You can't get elected to it, you get invited to join it,
right,
if you're one of the preferred people.
Right, got
so
you.
It's always erred on the side of industry because that's really where its roots are.
So what we've got is we've got a guidance standard which they've set, which has been adopted by most of the countries in Europe, and it's been something that the European Commission themselves recommend, including their expert body CENIR. But those guidelines are based on evidence that we know has a cause and effect for radio frequency radiation. So the only setting that exists at the moment for energy that's around the same frequency of mobile phone masts, mobile phones, decked cordless phones, wireless communication devices that we're used to on a daily basis, is the one that we know works for microwave ovens, i.e. if you generate enough energy and localise it in a small enough area, you heat things. You heat tissue, you heat anything that has some level of water in it.
None of the current rules are anything to do with chronic health effects or cancer. None of them, not one of them. They're all set for heating effects and acute effects like prickling of the skin or your eyebrows going up or something like that, you know. None of them are for long-term health effects.
So saying that it's below 40, that means nothing. It's meaningless.
It's meaningless. It is not intended to protect from long-term health effects.
ICNIRP is just irrelevant. It's irrelevant. Well, for example, if you want to make sure that nobody exceeds the speed limit past a school, set the speed limit at 1,000 miles an hour. Then everyone will obey the speed limit. No one will exceed it. You know, everyone can go sailing past this school at 999 miles an hour and the limit will be complied with.
the advisory body effectively are not set up to look at the evidence with regards to safeguarding the general public.
So essentially there to establish what's 100% fact, and anything that's not 100% fact is not their concern.
That's right. They'll talk about it, they'll summarise what there is, what there isn't, and what's left to find out, and then that's it. They'll leave it there. No recommendations, nothing, because they just don't see it as their job.
Who is it that sets the standards?
A group of people from a committee called ICNIRP.
The people who do the work on mobile phones are, by and large, engineers. They have no idea what is going on inside the living cell, but they are pontificating on this. They make the assumption that the only thing that can affect the well-being of a living organism is if it is powerful enough to heat the tissue. But that's like saying, we know if we boil an egg, it goes hard. What they don't know is that if they don't boil the egg, it turns into a chicken. And they haven't the slightest idea how that happens, but yet they pontificate as if they do. There's more evidence that it's carcinogenic than just possibly carcinogenic, but I can understand it in a way because most of the cancers which will arrive haven't arrived yet. I mean, people haven't been using cell phones for long enough for the true effect to become apparent.
But for years, the telecoms industry have defended their actions by asking the same question. As it turns out, they've been asking the wrong question. The answer is melatonin.
You know, melatonin is a hormone, and believe it or not, it's made in the brain. It's made in the pineal gland of the brain, and it's got a very powerful antioxidant status compared with vitamins. For example, melatonin is 5 times as powerful as vitamin C and twice as powerful as vitamin E. And it secretes only at night, and it's at night that we need it because that's when we go to sleep and when our brain repairs the cells of our body. And that's when melatonin comes out to do its work.
What are the consequences of having a reduced amount of melatonin?
Yeah. Well, you have a reduced amount of melatonin. What happens then is that your immune system starts to be less competent. For a start, you tend to get sleep disturbance. You can't get off to sleep, or if you do, you wake up and can't get back to sleep. You can have heart complications because melatonin protects your heart as well. And you're much more prone to disease because your immune system is not functioning at its best. So these are some of the things that happen when you have a lowered melatonin level. And for example, the average woman with breast cancer has only got 1/10 of the melatonin of a normal woman of her age. And for people with prostate cancer, they've got less than half the melatonin that they should have. Autistic children have less than half the melatonin levels that they should enjoy.
Reduced melatonin in night shift workers, because they're working at night and exposed to light, they don't produce nocturnal melatonin, is known to produce a 50% increase in breast cancer risk. And the International Agency for Research on Cancer, IARC, has actually classed night shift work as a class 2A probable carcinogen because of this melatonin reduction.
There are lots of studies now showing that people on night shifts or people who are blind have different cancer rates than the average population. And most of those studies support the view that the absence or the lowered melatonin has an adverse effect on health.
Because the body only repairs itself at night, melatonin is only produced when the pineal gland senses that no light is present.
What happens is that the pineal gland is light sensitive. It's sitting right where your brain receives signals from your eyes at crossover point in the middle. It's called the suprachiasmatic nuclei, and the connections from there goes directly to the pineal gland to tell it whether there's any light around or not. If there's light around, then there's also interference with the signals the brain wants to send to our cells in order to repair them. So it says there's no point in the brain sending these signals out to our cells to tell them to repair, because there's so much interference that they won't hear it. So it waits, the brain waits until it's dark.
What kind of research has shown that there's an effect on melatonin production from electric fields, magnetic fields, radio waves?
Right, well, the Battelle Institute in America has done a lot of work on this way back from the late 1970s, in fact. And their scientists there, Barry Wilson and Dick Stevens and people like that, started thinking that because we know that if you turn the light on, then the brain stops making melatonin, they thought, well, maybe our brains can't distinguish between electric fields and that we make ourselves artificially, and the natural light that we all know happens during the daytime, because we just don't make melatonin in the daytime. For very good biological reasons. So they thought, well, maybe these electric fields are suppressing the synthesis of melatonin, and that in turn is leading to cancer, breast cancer particularly, in women, because they don't have the immunological protection that they would otherwise have.
So the brain interprets radio waves as being light waves?
Yeah, we don't know the difference.
The hypothesis that the pineal gland cannot distinguish between light frequencies and man-made frequencies is certainly backed up by a wealth of research. Do you think it's pretty conclusive that electric fields, magnetic fields, radio waves affect the production of melatonin?
This research, which shows that kestrel melatonin levels fall with exposure, that white storks nesting on buildings near to radio masts have lowered progeny compared with stork nests a long way away from radio masts, studies on ants, studies on bees, and studies on birds of various kinds, studies on marine mammals, all point in the same direction.
But then there are studies in the laboratory of cells in the pineal gland which actually synthesizes the melatonin, and looking at the effects of magnetic fields on those cells. And at virtually every stage in the synthesis of melatonin, it's been shown that magnetic fields disturbs the actual production of melatonin. So you see, the evidence is in all aspects of the pathway of melatonin production, that the inhibition of melatonin production by magnetic fields, the research covers really every aspect of that pathway.
Would you say that it's almost conclusive?
Yes, I would say it is almost conclusive.
The genius of our body means it is able to counter the production of free radicals with the production of melatonin. We have created in ourselves a precise balance, a perfect system of defense. It has taken our body millions of years to perfect this technique. A technique created based on the surroundings we have evolved in. But over the last few decades, our surroundings have changed, and changed exponentially. To the naked eye, the world appears to be the same. But at a cellular level, it is the biggest change in environment life has ever encountered. It stands to reason that such a gargantuan change would inevitably upset such a delicate balance. And the consequences of our bodies not producing the right amount of melatonin could be disastrous. Scientists around the world now believe that free radicals could be the causal factor in every known disease, not just cancer.
In the beginning of the 1900s, childhood leukemia was a medical rarity. We've seen nothing but an increase in childhood leukemia ever since that point. It's going up every year by about 2%. And that applies to many other disorders as well. Autism, brain tumours, cancer. Cancer rates in the 1910s were probably half of what they are today. And many other diseases are being connected by studies, by scientific studies, with exposure to electromagnetic fields and radiations. Not just power lines, but also to radio fields and microwave fields. Because we've in the last 50 years, really, we've immersed ourselves in an ocean of electromagnetic radiation. It's all around us now. Invisible, we can't see it, but we know it's there. Every time you lift up your mobile phone, you know it's there.
It's very, very hard to turn the clock back, or if not impossible to turn the clock back. But we need to be aware of the adverse health effects so that we have the choice of taking precaution against the exposures, if that's what we wish to do, and that's what we need to do.
What worries me are things that are actually happening now. Right. That we haven't paid enough attention to, perhaps. And one of the things that's happening is autism, or to give it its proper name, autistic spectrum disorders.
Do you think we're getting to a point in science where we almost don't have a control group to be able to test things like this, because almost everybody has a mobile phone, almost everybody has Wi-Fi, almost everybody is exposed to electromagnetic fields?
Yes, we are reaching a situation where so many people are exposed to electromagnetic fields from mobile phones and Wi-Fi that we no longer have a control population to look at the difference between the health of people who are exposed versus the health of people who are not exposed. I mean, if I can take an analogy, we did find out that smoking caused lung cancer. That was because some people did not smoke, and they were a control group. If everyone had smoked, we may never have found that smoking caused lung cancer. And everyone would have been dying of lung cancer, and it would have been regarded as a sort of natural disease without ever having a link with smoking. What's happening with mobile phone exposure is we are losing this population of people who are not exposed. Even the few people who don't own a mobile phone are surrounded by the radiation from the mobile phone when they go shopping, when they go on a train, wherever they go.
It's not just the canary down the mine like myself. Eventually, if you simply increase the electromagnetic fields in the atmosphere, which we're doing, and we're now got a million times more electromagnetic fields, microwaves in the environment than we had 30 years ago, eventually it'll start to affect you.
It's very, very hard to say where we might be in 15 years' time, but I would very much hope within a few years' time we do recognise just how much these ill health effects are actually costing society. And then we might wake up and look at the causes and realise we have to do something about the causes.
Although we have embraced the wireless technology and accepted it into our everyday lives, at a cellular level, our bodies haven't. The frequencies that now surround us are as alien to ourselves as they would be to our eyes, if only we could see them. Our children are being born into a world that their bodies simply cannot understand. Where will all this lead?